Well, I guess we can go ahead and start. This is our fourth lecture in the series. Hooray! So, we did the Christ against culture, and then the Christ of culture last week, and today we're going to look at the first of the median types, which is the Christ above culture. So, Christ against culture, Christ of culture, and today the first of the median types is Christ above culture. And the Christ above culture one is a very, very interesting one to look at. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. I just wanted to start off with a quick overview of what we have looked at so far. This is kind of the typologies, the 5 typologies that Niebuhr presents in his book. The first one was the Christ against culture typology. And then we had the Christ of culture typology. The against were those radical Christians, the ones who the culture is bad, the culture is evil, and so they withdraw completely from the culture. They want nothing to do with the culture at all, so they're monastics. They go out into the desert and separate themselves from the world, but they can't separate themselves entirely from culture because they build their own monastic culture anyways to begin with, or like the Amish up in Pennsylvania, they have their own particular culture too, even though they have withdrawn from society. So that was a Christ against culture typology. And then last week we did the Christ of culture typology. And these are like polar opposites, the against and the of. They are very, very different. The Christ of culture is they don't see any point of tension between their Christian walk or their faith and the world at large, the secular world. So it's Christ of culture. Culture and Christianity, there's no tension between the two for these people. They live in the world as Christians, and they're very comfortable being in the world as Christians. Well, those two, if you really think about it, they're kind of like the radical polar opposites, right? So it would almost be like if we put it in a line, that the against culture would be on one side, and the of would be on the other side. And then in between, you would find the median types, which are the other 3 that we're going to be looking at. The first one that we're going to be looking at today of the median types is the Christ above culture. And then the week after, the next week we're going to be looking at Christ and culture in paradox. And then finally, the last one of them we'll be looking at is Christ transforming culture. Now notice, these are called the median types for a reason. That's because if you look at the circles, they have some point of connection between them, right? So it's not like you're separated entirely from the culture, as in the first typology, the Christ against culture, where you withdraw from culture entirely. Nor is it like the Christ of culture, where there's hardly any point of difference between Christianity and culture. It's almost like just extremely comfortable with the culture at large. Rather, the medium types do have points of difference, but they also have points of contact within the culture at large. And so the one that we're going to be looking at today, the first of the median types, is the Christ above culture typology. So let's just go ahead and jump right into the book. As Niebuhr explains this one, the Christ above culture. He calls it, first of all, the great majority movement in Christianity. And the reason why is because the vast majority of Christians are Christ above culture types. And if you think of it this way, this is the Catholic model for the Catholic Church. And even today, in today's world, when we look at statistics of Christianity all over the world, over 50% of Christians in the world are Catholics. That's the majority of Christians even today are Catholics. Protestants are a smaller sect, and then you have the Eastern Orthodox, and then a few other little small sects here and there. But the majority of Christians in the world are Catholics. So Niebuhr begins by saying this position, the Christ above culture typology, is the vast majority, the great majority movement in Christianity, which we may call the Church of the Center. The Church of the Center, because we saw that the other 2 were the polar opposites, the Christ against culture and the Christ of culture. These are the polar opposites. So this one is centered. It's centrist. It's one of those movements that well, the three median types. It has, so it has elements of both, but it never fully acquiesces to either side of the line, of the demarcation. So this Church of the Center has refused to take either the position of the anti-cultural radicals, the Christ against cultural types. They refuse that position. It's not the right position. Or that of the accommodators of Christ to culture, the Christ of culture types. So it refuses the polar opposites. That's why it's the Church of the Center. Yet it has not regarded its efforts at solution of the Christ culture problem as compromising. The criticism from the extreme people are, oh, you're just compromising, right? But they don't see themselves as compromising their Christian faith at all with the culture. However sinful it knows all human efforts to be. For it, the fundamental issue, and this is very key here, the fundamental issue doesn't lie between Christ and the world. That's not the issue at stake. It's not about Christ and the world, as important as that issue is, but what's the fundamental issue? It's between God and man. So it's not about Christ and the world, but God and man. That's why you got the Christ above culture. The fundamental issue, the main enduring problem for Christians in the world is not with the world itself, but with God. It's a hierarchical structure problem. That's what Niebuhr points out in the beginning. And then he goes on to say, one of the theologically stated convictions with which the Church of the Center approaches a cultural problem is that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. This is key to the Christ above culture position. Jesus is the Son of God. He is divine. It's the Trinity, the Trinitarian aspect. And that really differentiates them a lot from the Christ of culture people. Because for the Christ of culture people, the divinity of Jesus isn't necessarily something that important, as we saw last week. For them, Jesus serves as a great moral exemplar, as a good ethical teacher, somebody to emulate, a life of that sort. But in this position, what differentiates them from the Christ of culture people is, hey, Jesus is the Son of God. So think about your Catholic friends. Of course, they have a very high Christology. They look at Jesus, and Jesus is very, very centered on their Catholic faith. So Jesus Christ is the Son of God, the Father Almighty, who created heaven and earth. With that formulation, it introduces into discussion about Christ and culture the conception of nature on which all culture is founded, and which is good. Nature is good and rightly ordered by the one to whom Jesus Christ is obedient and with whom he is inseparably united. So where this conviction rules Christ and the world, if this is the case, nature is good, God created nature this way, then Christ and the world cannot be simply opposed to each other. So you can't have the Christ against culture typology. Something's wrong with that typology. Neither can you have the Christ of typology. That's why they're in the center. And they don't regard their centrist view as something which is compromising their Christian faith with the world at all. No, certainly not. It's because of this theological depths that they have. The Christ and the world are not polar opposites to each other. Neither can the world as culture be simply regarded as a realm of godlessness. So this is basically what we're talking about. In the Christ above culture typology, God is God. He is above everything, right? God, Jesus, the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that's God. And he is far and above nature and our secular world, our secular cultures. But get this, this God who is above everything created nature. And he created the world. Therefore, nature and the world are good, inherently good in themselves. Of course, they recognize that with the advent of sin, it has become corrupted, but the inherent goodness of nature is still there. And it's therefore, it's a good thing. the world and the nature. And culture is therefore a good thing because culture is built on top of nature. It is what God originally intended for humanity. And if God intended it, it means that it's something that's good. And we saw that in Genesis 1:26, where we had the cultural mandate when God makes Adam and Eve, and then he gives them the first command in the Bible. And what's the first command? Go, replicate, fill the earth, multiply and fill the earth. That's the cultural mandate, to go ahead and make something out of this creation that I've made for you. So in this perspective, the good God who is above all things created a good world for us to inhabit, and therefore this good world in which we are supposed to make culture makes culture something that is God ordained. And if it is God ordained, then it can't be something bad. Got it? So that's basically the kind of simple gist of what this typology looks like. So neither can the world as culture be simply regarded as a realm of godlessness. It's not evil, it's not corrupt. It's God's good creation. And you look in Genesis chapter 1, every single day that God creates something in creation, and then at the end of the day, he looks back at what he created and he says, good. Right? And the Hebrew word for good over there is tov. Every single day after he's created something, tov. This is good. And then on the sixth day, when he creates Adam and Eve, human beings, he says, tov ma'od. Exceedingly good. This is wonderful stuff. Creation is good. So you can't just look at culture as the realm of godlessness. Since it is at least founded, it is, at the very least, it's founded on the world as nature. And so it cannot exist save as it is upheld by the Creator and the governor of nature. The God who is above all things. He's the creator of it. And not only did he create it, but he rules over it. He's the governor in the sense that everything is subject to his rule, to his authority. And if that's the case, then the world is a good thing. All of the culture that we have in the world ultimately turns out to be good. So Christ above culture doesn't mean that the world is bad. Because it's created by the God who is above all things, it's actually a very good thing. Niebuhr goes on to say this. He says this, for the cultural Christian, reconciliation of the gospel with the spirit of the times is made possible by its presentation either as a revelation of speculative truth about being or of practical knowledge of value. But the true synthesist will have nothing to do with easy subordinations of value to being or being to value. It's not an easy synthesis. It's not something that you can do very, very easily. It takes effort and struggle and deep thought in order for you to be able to synthesize Christ and culture in the world in this way. So this person, the cultural Christian, sees Jesus Christ as both the Logos and Lord. So he's the sovereign God and he's the Logos, the Word from which all things are created, through whom God has created all things. Hence, then, he affirms both Christ and culture. See, the Logos is this principle of wisdom and reason and philosophy. So he affirms that too, as well as the Christ figure, the risen Messiah. He does so as one who knows that the Christ who requires his loyalty is greater, more complex in character than the easier reconciliations envisage. The polar extremes, the Christ of culture and the Christ against culture, those reconciliations are too easy. They're caricatures of what the real struggle is for the Christian living in the world. Something of the same sort is true of his understanding of culture. Culture, for them, is both divine and human in its origin. It's both holy and sinful. A realm of both necessity and freedom, and one to which both reason and revelation apply. So are you seeing these things? These kind of like dyads, reason, revelation, holy, sinful, necessity, freedom, these kinds of things that need to be reconciled. They need to be synthesized in this view in order for a person to live in this kind of a typology. As his understanding of the meaning of Christ separates him from the cultural believer. So this is key. See, the Christ of culture person doesn't really have a high Christology. But for this person, it's a very high Christology, Christ. So that's what separates him from the cultural believer. So his appreciation of culture divides him from the radical, the two polar extremes. And so in this view, it's called the synthesis view. There is in the synthesis view a gap between Christ and culture that accommodation Christianity never takes seriously enough, and the radicalism does not try to overcome. So we saw this radical line of demarcation. On one side was the extreme view, Christ against culture, and on the other side was the Christ of culture. And for the synthetists, however, they're right in the middle of this view. And they see serious problems with the Christ of culture, the accommodationist view, because it never really takes seriously the gap between Christ and culture. You know, they're so united that you don't know the difference between Christ and culture. Or the radical view on the other side, which doesn't try to overcome the difference at all. They just separate and withdraw from the society at large. And that's not the Christ above culture typology. The thing about this is you have to recognize that it's incredibly complex. The world is a complex place. It's not simple. Therefore, you're not going to be able to live in this world with very simple black and white answers. There's shades of gray and colors in between. And you need to be able to recognize that in order to live well in the world as God would intend for you to live, in a world that is beautifully created and yet fallen and corrupted. So how do you negotiate those two polar opposites in this perspective? By looking at Christ as the one who is above the culture at large, who is in sovereign control of that culture. He's not just the creator of it, but he is also the what? The governor over it. He rules over all creation. And therefore, there's something good that comes out of this creation. So, all of the things, the things in the world, like the cultural institutions that we have, the government, the political structure, the commercial structure, the educational system, all of these things are God-ordained part of culture. So in this view, you can actually participate fully in the culture. You can go to university and get an education. You can become a firefighter. You can become a soldier. You can become a police officer. You participate in the culture because these institutions out there in the world are actually ordained by God for us. They're set on this earth by God so that we can live in it. And there are a couple of scriptures that I would like to go over which kind of support this position. So just bear with me. First of all, we'll look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 19. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law of the prophets. I didn't come to throw away your culture. I'm not a cultural despiser. Although for a lot of Jews, they perceive Jesus as a threat to their culture in that time and so forth. But Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish Torah, the part of your culture which is so important, or the prophets. None of that stuff. I didn't come to do that. Actually, I have come not to abolish, but to do what? To fulfill it. I'm here to fulfill your cultural expectations. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, that's until the end of time, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches us to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. The governmental institutions, the laws of your land, all of these things, I didn't come to abolish these things. They're set there, they have a purpose, and actually it keeps society civil. It keeps the bad characters from running rampant and chaotic through culture, which is what happens when your culture deteriorates in places like Syria, where they've had a civil war going on forever, and you don't get those kinds of things, and it's lawlessness rules the land. It's almost like what happened in the wild west in America for a while, and all these Billy the Kid types and lawless people and Jesse James. It's not a good thing. We need to uphold the law. Jesus didn't come to abolish that part. He understands that these things are good for the culture at large. And then Paul, the Apostle Paul in Romans 13, verse 1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, the government. If you're a follower of Christ, you need to be subject to the government. Obey its rules and regulations. Obey the stipulations that they have for society at large. Why? Because God, Paul will go on to argue, has what? Has instituted the government for our own good. For there is no authority except from God. It comes from who? The God who is above the culture. God instituted the government. And those authorities that do exist under God have been instituted by whom? By God. Government, schools, education, laws, regulations, rules, libraries, swimming pools, clubhouses, all of this stuff is part of our cultural baggage that has been instituted by God for the betterment of our human culture, our human society, the God who is above it all. That's what we're talking about. Do you remember the one time when the Pharisees and Sadducees were trying to trick Jesus, and they came up to him and had this real good doozy of a question, a very hard trick question, where they were telling him, because either answer that he would give, he would get himself in trouble. So the question was, Rabbi, we know that you're a good man, a good and wise man, and they kind of butter him up in the beginning. And then comes the question. The question is, should we pay taxes to Caesar? Now, in that first century Jewish culture, that's a loaded question, folks. Because if he answers yes, it means the revolutionary Jews who are yearning for their independence, you're against them. But if you answer no, then the Romans can come and crucify you. So it's like they catch Jesus in a trap. And Jesus goes, oh, you perverted, sinful people. Can you give me a coin? So they give him a coin. And he looks at the coin and says, whose image do you see on that coin? Well, it's Caesar's image. And then he says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. Wow, that's genius. It's crazy genius, so if you really think about it. But it's this idea that God has set up even Caesar in the world to rule, establish things, and so forth. So, those revolutionary zealot Jews who are out there doing all kinds of things to gain their freedom and fighting against the Roman Empire, they just might not be doing the proper thing. I don't know. It's complicated. It's a very complex thing, right? So Jesus gives this double answer. This double answer which is incredibly complicated. It's not easy to be a Christ above culture type in the world that we live in. And so I think just recently we had a big controversy happened with Jeff Sessions, our Attorney General. You all remember that? Jeff Sessions, he was, because of the immigration issue where they were separating the children from these illegal immigrants that were coming into the country, and the INS was separating the children from the parents to the point where the parents didn't know where the children were ever, and there was threat that they would never be able to find their children again. And that became a huge public outcry, right? And what did Attorney General Jeff Sessions do in his Q&A when he was talking about this? He quoted Romans 13:1 at that point. The scripture that we just read, he said, I would cite you to the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the government, because God has ordained the government for his purposes. These people are breaking the law. And he's using Romans 13:1 as justification then for separating lawbreakers from their children. So he's taking this Christ above culture typology, actually. Say, God has instituted the government, and we need to obey its laws and keep civility in our culture. Otherwise, it'll deteriorate, become something like the Wild Wild West again, or ISIS in Syria, or something where lawlessness runs rampant. We can't have that in this society. Therefore, I'm citing Romans 13. Let's respect the rule of law in our land. That was what Jeff Sessions was saying. And there was this huge public outcry over this among Christians. Even conservative Christians hated this. They're saying, you're misquoting Romans 13. That's not what Paul intended by saying that about the government. And so even conservative Christians like Franklin Graham was saying this does not justify the separation of parents from their children at all. A whole bunch of conservative Republican-type Christians cried out in protest, so much so to the point that Donald Trump had to go back from his policy which he had instituted for the separation of families like that. And about a week and a half later, he had to take that out, because he wasn't getting criticized from the liberal part. Of course he was, but it was his own conservative base, evangelical Christianity. They're saying you can't do that to families. That's not what Romans 13 is about at all. And so Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who by the way is a wonderful Christian, I'm told. I don't know him personally, but I'm told that he teaches Sunday school at a United Methodist Church, in his own local UMC church, you know. And the interesting thing is that even his own bishop in the UMC was critical of him. His interpretation of Romans is wrong. And a lot of the UMC people who, incidentally, I think some of the UMC is about a Christ of culture typology. They tend to be very liberal in their theology. So perhaps that's why they saw this thing as wrong. And so the overwhelming majority of Christian leaders, including the conservative ones, including people like Franklin Graham, voiced strong criticism resulting in drastic policy changes on the immigration policy that Trump had established. And so, you know, the families who cross the border together won't stay together, this kind of a thing, it got eliminated. It's no longer, they no longer do that to the undocumented families that come into this country. They try to keep them together, or at least maintain the relationship between the family and the children. It kind of reminded me of what happened in Burma, Myanmar, which is a largely Buddhist country. It's most like 99% Buddhist or something, but there are small pockets of Christian populations in there, and there's this ethnic group that was being severely persecuted in Burma. You all remember that lady who was in prison for a long time and then got set free, and she's now the leader of the nation, but she won like the Peace Prize, and now the Nobel people want to revoke that prize because she is participating in genocide for a particular ethnic group in Burma. And these people have been put in refugee camps, and guess what they did to them? And a lot of them are Christians, by the way. They separated them from their children. So these parents don't know where their children are. And I know this because some of these refugees came to America. Some of them ended up in North Carolina, of all places, these Burmese refugees. And there's a story of a church that kind of hosted them and helped these Burmese refugees settle in America. And one of the kids in the Sunday school was playing with one of these Burmese children and said, "Hey, your parents are really nice. I like them a lot." And he turns to the American kid and goes, "They're not my parents." "What? No, they're not." So what happened? Well, when we were in the refugee camp, everybody got separated. So when we were finally able to come to America, these adults, they just grabbed some children and took them with them. And that's what happened. And so the situation with immigration kind of reminded me of that. And it's just plain dopey. I don't even have a right word for it. Even for conservatives, it was like, what the hell are you doing? Ridiculous. Don't do that. Separating families. And then quoting scripture as justification for something like that. You see the scripture in Romans chapter 13 about honoring the government and the laws of the land? Well, imagine if you lived in communist Russia and they were persecuting Christianity back then. Would you be able to do that? Absolutely not. So it's very circumstantial. It depends on the kinds of things that the government is actually instituting. If they're instituting policies which are unjust or even criminal in some countries, in some places, then as a Christian you have a right to withdraw and lean more towards a Christ against culture typology in that regard, rather than uphold the laws of the land. So that's the criticism against Jeff Sessions for what he was doing when he was invoking this kind of Christ above culture typology. God has instituted all of these cultural institutions. Therefore, we need to honor them, was what he was saying. But here's the pointer, and this is very biblical if you don't look at just one passage but the entire Bible. So long as the cultural institutions are doing the right thing, we should be okay. But if they're doing the wrong thing, then you as a Christian have a right to protest or to withdraw from that kind of a thing. So it was a very, very interesting thing that happened. And to me, it highlighted the fact of Jeff Sessions, this conservative Christian gentleman who comes from a Christ above culture perspective, asking us as a nation to honor the government's policies in these regards. Now, wherever you stand on this issue is something that's very complex. It's not black and white. It's not easy to handle immigration policy in this country. Is it? No. It's going to be incredibly difficult, incredibly complex. And so we need to figure out ways to handle this in a Christian way. But what this Christ of Culture lecture series is teaching us is that Christians can disagree in the ways that they do these things in the world at large, because they come from different typologies, right? Which leads me to the model example that Niebuhr gives in his book for the Christ above culture typology, and that would be Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, 13th century, born circa 1224, died about 1274. So we're talking about right around the time of the Italian Renaissance, a period of where they rediscovered a lot of Greek philosophy, and particularly the philosopher Aristotle got rediscovered, because Aristotle had been lost to the Western world for a very long time. And most of the Western world in its early stages was Platonic. It was all about the philosopher Plato. But then in the Renaissance period, and this is very interesting, Aristotle had actually been preserved by the Muslims in the Eastern world. The Muslims had preserved Aristotle. And then right around this time in the Renaissance is when they rediscovered Aristotle. By trading with Muslims and so forth, they discovered Aristotle rediscovered him again, and he made a big impact in the Renaissance period, especially in Italy, where Thomas Aquinas is from. And Thomas Aquinas was a brilliant scholar. The Scholastic Movement, the high medieval ages and the Scholastic Movement, well, he is the cream of the crop for that period of time when rationality, intelligence, education, and learning were sky high in this sort of a period. And so what Thomas Aquinas did was he took these Aristotelian premises and developed his theology from Aristotle. And then he became a proponent of natural theology, reason. Through nature, you can learn something about God. God has given us our faculties to reason and to think. And when we employ those faculties, we can discover something about God through our natural affinities. And so this is a gift that God has given to you, and it's a good gift. Use it. And so he developed a theology, and he was the first ever systematic theologian. This guy was a complete, utter genius in his time. He's still considered one of the greatest philosophers in the world by secular philosophers also. So this was Thomas Aquinas. The difference between Aristotle and Plato, well, I'm going to kind of make it very simple, so it's going to be a bit of a caricature. But generally speaking, Plato's worldview is from the top down. Aristotle's worldview is the opposite, is from the bottom up. So they're fundamentally incompatible philosophies. So when Platonic philosophy dominated the Western world for a long time, you had a lot of mysticism, a lot of the high things. You remember the Gnostics, Neoplatonists? It was all about, the high things and not the natural world. The natural world was evil. Material world was not a good place. So that was Platonism. High, down. Aristotle took it and reversed it. Aristotle came a little bit after Plato. And he said, no. Let's study the natural world. Let's study the base things. And from there we can then draw up to the high things. So it was the exact opposite of Platonic philosophy or Platonic worldview. Now the Aristotelian worldview is what we live in even today. Because that's what gives birth to such things as science. And we live in a scientific world. What is science about? It's the study of the natural world. So physics is important for Aristotelians. Metaphysics is important for Platonists. It's fundamentally incompatible worldviews. So in the Italian Renaissance here in the 12th, 13th centuries, the rediscovery of Aristotle, the education flourished. And science, what we know as modern science, began its birth in that period of time. And you had people like Galileo and all studying the natural, lowly things rather than concentrate on the high things, which they had done previously in the Middle Ages. So in the High Middle Ages, we got a fundamental shift in the way that people went about looking at the world. And so this is what Thomas Aquinas did too. He posited that with our natural resources, we could arrive at a view of God, which was radically different from what the world had done up to that point. So by the natural reason, in the natural world, nature reveals God. So if we study nature, if we do science, we can find out about God. And he has biblical precedent for that too. Paul in the book of Romans talks about nature revealing God. David in the Psalms, the heavens and the earth declare your majesty. So if you study nature, you should arrive at God from the bottom up. So that was Thomas Aquinas' theology. And he wrote one of the most enduring books in the world, which we still read today, called the Summa Theologica, the sum of all things about God. Now that's an ambitious title, isn't it? Summa Theologica, which incidentally he never finished. But it's so huge, and it's become one of the most influential works of Western literature. And it's this Aristotelian premise of examining things from the bottom up and working our way up to theology, which is radically different from the way that theology had been done in the Platonic world. So it's just a radical shift. In fact, the English philosopher Anthony Kenny calls him one of the dozen greatest philosophers of the Western world. Incidentally, I do have the Summa Theologica on my Kindle because it's free. There's no copyright on those kinds of old texts. And on occasion I like reading it because it's fascinating stuff. From nature, from the natural. What Summa Theologica, what most people know, if a caricature of the Summa Theologica is the natural arguments that Thomas Aquinas gives for the existence of God. He has like 6 or 7 different arguments based on nature that ultimately posit out that there must be a God. And that comes from Aristotelian down, bottom up thinking, reasoning, way up to the top, right? So even Aristotle back in his day, before Christ, in that period, had already talked about the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover. You go cause and effect all the way back. You can't have an infinite regress of cause and effect for all of eternity. It just doesn't work that way. Therefore, there must be a first uncaused cause, the unmoved mover who started it all. And that uncaused cause is God. That's Aristotelian thinking. Using your logic, your brain, your rationality, your purposes to posit the existence of a supreme being. That's what we're talking about. And that's the kind of argumentation that Thomas Aquinas makes in his Summa Theologica. And it's fascinating stuff. It's scholastic. It's for high-minded people. It's use of logic and intelligence. You can argue with people to death for months and months and months with this kind of stuff. And both of you just enjoy a good laugh, have a good beer along that path, right? It's good stuff. Thomas Aquinas. But that's what this view looks like. Yes, Diana?
He became a saint, didn't he?
Yeah, St. Thomas Aquinas.
What did he do as a philosopher? I mean, was he in the church? Was he...
He was basically a professor, a teacher of higher education, a doctor, a doctor of divinity is what I would call it. Of course, they didn't use the term doctor of divinity back then, but he was a doctor in the church. And keep in mind, in this period, the persons responsible for education in the culture at large were who? The church. So, brilliant philosopher. He's the guy who brought Aristotle into the Western world, and we are still living in an Aristotelian paradigm to this day. Science, modernity, reason, rationality. Although that has been somewhat crumbling now that we live in post-modernity a little bit, but that's the huge, significant impact that a person like Thomas Aquinas has had on us today, and in the way that we think and reason about the world and about God. So that's what Aristotle is, and he's the prime example in Niebuhr's book, Christ and Culture, of this typology of Christ above culture. So this is what Niebuhr says about him. Thomas also answers the question about Christ and culture with a both and. Not an either or, but a both and. Christ and culture. Except, of course, against the extremes, Christ of culture, it's not the same but Christ is above it, and Christ is the one who rules over the culture and institutes it. Therefore, the culture must be good because it's given to us by God, by Christ. So it's a both and. Against the Christ against culture types, who it's only one thing, Christ and not the culture, and against the Christ of culture types where, it's equal. No, it's not equal. Christ is above it. Yet his Christ is what? Far above culture. And he does not try to disguise the gulf that lies between them. His own manner of life, this is Thomas Aquinas, and maybe this is why he's a saint, because he lived it. His own manner of life indicates how he unites the two claims, the two hopes and beginnings. So what is he? He's a monk. He's faithful to the vows of poverty, celibacy, and obedience. With the radical Christians, he's rejected the secular world. But he is a monk in the church. And this is the thing. He's not a monk out in the desert somewhere. He's a monk in the church, which has become the guardian of culture. By this time, we're talking about Renaissance time, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. The church has become the guardian of the culture at large. The fosterer of learning. They were responsible for the education. The judge of the nations. They put people to death. They were the justice system, the protector of the family, the governor of social religion. Christendom in this period of time was entirely powerful. It was very, very strong. And so this great medieval organization symbolized in the person of Thomas itself represents the achievement of a remarkable practical synthesis. And that's why these people, the Christ above culture people, are referred to as synthetists. It is a secular church against which monasticism raised its radical protest in obedience to a Christ against culture. So it has incorporated that extreme Christ against culture thing. However, yet this protest has been incorporated into the church without losing its radical character. So that's the synthesis, Christ and the world. But in order for the synthesis to happen properly, Christ needs to be in his proper place, which is up at the top of all things. In his system of thought, he combined without confusing philosophy and theology. He was an Aristotelian to the core, and he used that particular philosophical framework to develop his natural theology. And then you'll see all these binaries, state and church, civic Christian virtues, natural divine laws, Christ and culture. Out of these various elements, he built a great structure of theoretical and practical wisdom, which like a cathedral was solidly planted among the streets and marketplaces, the house, palaces, universities that represent human culture. His influence was extremely pervasive for centuries, but which, when one had passed through its doors, presented a strange new world of quiet spaciousness, of sounds and colors, actions and figures, symbolic of a life beyond all secular concerns. So that's what the Christ above culture kind of thing looks like. Thomas Aquinas is probably the greatest of all the synthesists, and synthesis is never easy. It's not black and white. It's shades of color and multi-varied and complex, and you have to work out all of these things, and that's why God has given you a brain. In fact, one of the things that Thomas Aquinas derides viciously in his works is anti-intellectualism. He says, God gave you this gift, use it. In fact, he encourages science. He encourages looking at nature, rocks and trees and plants and stuff, and developing a scientific worldview, because ultimately that scientific worldview gives glory to whom? To the God who is above it all. And so he is voraciously angry with Christians who state unscientific things. You guys are fools. In fact, you're doing a disservice to the Christ whom you purport to be serving when you state unscientific, irrational things about the world. Therefore, what I want you to do, Thomas Aquinas says to those sorts of Christians, is get an education. Remove the cobwebs from your brain and use it, employ it. Employ the reason that God, gifted reason that He has given to you in order to build from the ground up this huge Summa Theologica. That's what we're talking about. So for him, Thomas Aquinas, the world, the great institutions of the world, government, church, educational system, commerce, all of these things are given by God, ordained and given by God. Therefore, we can fully participate in them in order to build a beautiful, wonderful, fair society for all. Thomas does not construct an easy synthesis. This ain't an easy job to do. Of successive stages so that man ascends from rectitude, from the bottom up, right? It was all about what? The bottom up. From rectitude in the practical life to the imperfect happiness of contemplation. This isn't an easy synthesis of going from the bottom to the top. And thence to the perfect happiness of eternal blessedness. The stages are there. In Aquinas' thinking, you will find this hierarchy of stages from the bottom all the way to the top. But a leap is required as man advances from one stage to the other stage, to the other stage. And a leap may carry him across an intermediate stage also. More than that, the steep ascent to heaven, though always involving human activity, proceeds only by power sacramentally bestowed from above. In this system, in Thomas Aquinas' system, it's a hierarchical system. Christ above, and everything is built in hierarchies. God, who is sovereign and supreme over all things, has instituted the government, and therefore the people who are vice regents to govern over the people have been put there by God. And then down the political spectrum, all the way down to your local town mayor. This is the hierarchy of government. And you can find all sorts of hierarchies in Thomistic thinking. And so this is the system. Even in salvation, you work your way from the ground up. And this is the thing about Catholic theology. Catholic theology is not a grace theology, grace only. You're saved by grace alone. Not in Catholicism. In Catholicism, it's a mixture of works and faith. Right? So you work your way towards salvation. And then what does God do from above? If you are found to be working, earnestly seeking it, then God comes and infuses His grace into you. So works and faith and grace are what bring you to salvation. In Catholic theology to this day, I can argue with a Catholic all day long. I'm saved by grace through faith. And he'll go, no, you got to work. And God then will come and help you out. You all know that phrase, right? God helps those who help themselves. That's a very Thomistic thinking of how to achieve salvation. But it's fundamentally and radically different from the Protestant, which is most of us in this room, I would surmise, which is, works do not save us at all. We are saved by grace and grace alone. And so we're going to see that later in the 16th century. So from the 13th, Thomas Aquinas, all the way to the 16th century, this Thomistic Aristotelian Summa Theologica reigned supreme until a weird monk, Augustinian monk named Martin Luther, showed up on the scene. And from that point on, we'll look at a different typology, which started to dominate among Protestant circles, of course. But of course, Aristotelianism is still huge because Christianity is predominantly Catholic even to this day. I love my Catholic brothers and sisters, and I know that many of them are good folks who are saved. But their theology to me is radically different from my Protestant understanding of theology also. So these vertical hierarchies exist all over Thomistic or Christ above culture theology. So from God to human rulers to vice regents all the way down to the mayor in the town. You have that in everything. Police departments, you have a hierarchy. Fire department, you have a hierarchy. You got the newbies, right? They do all the toilet cleaning and stuff, don't they? And then once you become the fire chief, you tell them what to do. It's all hierarchies. The papal system, the Pope, hierarchy of bishops and archbishops, all the way filtered all the way up to the Pope, who is the vice regent, and just above him is God. So we get this Catholic hierarchy. And the thing about the hierarchies in Thomistic thinking is it's not just human productions of culture. It's God ordained. And when we're working our way up the hierarchies, God provides what Thomas calls a superadditum of divine supernatural grace. Our efforts alone, our work alone will never get us there. But it's God meeting us in our measly little efforts with His superadditum of divine grace that brings us up into the greatest spheres of all sorts of things, including salvation. So that's the Catholic soteriology. And soteriology is just a big fancy word for the doctrine of salvation. And it's radically different from you and me if we're Protestants. So in this life, then, you need to work. You need to be a moral, responsible, good person. Honoring your government, keeping the laws, driving 55 on a 55 and not 56, because you're breaking the law, man. Right? You need to be a good, responsible citizen of the world. Work, work, work. Don't break laws. Jesus didn't come to break the law. He came to fulfill it. You see. And to honor your government. So long as the government is not being oppressive to people. Moral responsibility is important, therefore, in Catholic theology, in Thomas Aquinas and his thinking. So we close out then by looking at some of the strengths and weaknesses of this Christ above culture position, just as we have with the other two that we have looked at previously. Well, on the strength side, of course, there's always it's a search for unity. Christ above culture. It takes seriously the culture at large and our Christianity, and tries to synthesize and harmonize that in a way that's not easy to do, but which ultimately leads to this hierarchy where God is above everything else. So God's supremacy is ultimately recognized in this hierarchical structure. And moral unity, the sense that you need to be a good, moral, responsible human being on this earth which God has given to us and instituted the governments and the education and all of this kind of stuff which you should avail yourselves of, because they are good gifts from a good God for us to do. And that's why it's good for us to be learning these things and filling our brains with all thoughts and ideas, using logic and reason in the world. And then there's also one of the strengths is the union of church and state, because we honor and respect the government, the political system. And we're talking, of course, about the medieval, high medieval times where there's no real separation between church and state. The church was incredibly politically powerful. It was like a nation state of its own in its own time. All the Pope had to do was say to the kings out there, hey, we need people to go fight the Crusades. And all these kings from all over Europe, okay, send your people over. That's how powerful the Pope was in those days. And there was this union of church and state, and that can be a strength. We don't think of it that way in our modern American society, but when you have the unity of the church and the state, it's envisioned almost completely in the person of Jesus Christ, who is both a prophet and a king. He's the King Jesus. So in Christ you have the unity of the political system and the religious system. Okay? So, and then in this thing there's also then cooperation with non-believers in carrying on the work of the world. It's not like the Christ against culture types where I'll withdraw. I'm not going to participate. Let them pretend that they're going to create their own utopia. I'll just laugh at them. They're just going to make a mess of the world anyway. I know. No, in this view, they will participate even with non-Christians for the betterment of the world. Because what? All of the social institutions have been ordained by God anyways. You know, when Paul wrote Romans 13, it didn't mean that the emperor in Rome was a Christian. He was a godless despot. And yet Paul says to the Romans, honor and respect the government. You see. Weaknesses? Well, sometimes quest for unity can lead to huge problems. And in this particular one, it can go into one system which reduces the infinite to the finite. Quest for unity into one system reduces the infinite to the finite. What do we mean by this? The infinite to the finite. The temporal embodiment of this unity in a man-devised form represents a usurpation in which time seeks to exercise the power of eternity and man the power of God. What ultimately ends up happening in hierarchical systems is the guy who rises up to the top becomes a despot. That's what the problem becomes, right? And we see this all the time, not just in the secular government, but in churches. You put a pastor who is the despot of the church, and you will have severe problems and issues, right? So, and the thing is, the person who gains all the power becomes like God. He gets to tell everybody else what to do, what to say. So he takes the infinite, that is the godly realm, in himself, although he is finite. And ultimately, the hierarchical system in the Catholic Church, sometimes the Pope is looked on that way. And that can be a serious problem. And something that we Protestants recognize as a huge fault in the hierarchical system of the Catholic Church. Does the Pope really truly speak for God? Or does he speak for himself sometimes? Or does he make mistakes when he's speaking ex cathedra? Right? So this quest for unity into one system sometimes reduces the infinite, the really important, incredible things, and brings them down to the finite realm. And that can be a problem. Or the hierarchical view also is historical and medieval. It functioned well in the medieval world because everything was hierarchical. But in a modern democratic pluralistic society, no. We don't have hierarchical systems as our main source of government. People have power. Power has been brought down into all sorts of levels. So, yes, it worked well for a certain period of time in history where these hierarchies were all over the place. But in our modern democratic systems, this could be a problem. And so, you know, one of the complaints that a lot of Catholics have about the Catholic Church is, hey, they're still back in the medieval ages. Come on, let's progress. Let's move forward. And it never does. Another weakness is that it's devoted to the conservation of culture and thus becomes a cultural Christian. So tradition becomes extremely important. In the Catholic Church, it's all about what? Tradition, 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 tradition. Let's conserve our traditions. And those traditions somehow take over and can become corrupted. And that's what 300-400 years later, an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther would see in the Catholic Church. The corruption of the traditions and people doing things without any understanding why they were doing it. And then lastly, union of church and state has a whole bunch of historical problems. We look back at Christendom, the period of time in European history when the church and the state were united and they had severe political power and they did some horrible things. Inquisitions and crusades and killed, and Galileo, throw him in prison because we don't want to do science. Although Summa Theologica, Thomas Aquinas was like, this is the way we have to do. But they were still influenced by the Platonic worldview. So these radical changes were very difficult to happen over time. So union of church and state presents problems throughout history. And so that's one of the great benefits of living in the United States of America, where we have this separation of church and state. If you really think about it, what's the problem in Europe? The problem in Europe is that all of these European countries have a church and state that is still united. The Anglican Church is the Church of England. The Lutheran Church is the Church of Germany. It's a state church. And so if you are a priest or a pastor in, let's say, the Anglican Church in the UK, you are an employee of the state. You get paid by the state. Actually. Same thing in Germany, France, Italy, wherever they have these churches where there's not been the separation of church and state. So we have that in America, and I think that it's a very strong and a good thing if we know exactly what it means to separate church and state. Well, we'll close out today by looking once again at this 5 typologies. Up to now we've studied 3 of them then, and the Christ against culture, the Christ of culture, and then we looked at the Christ above culture today. Next week we're going to look at the Christ and culture in paradox typology, which will introduce us to Martin Luther and the advent of the Great Reformation, because that's Luther's view of the world. Notice that the median types, the 3 medium types at the bottom, are very, very similar in structure. And that's no coincidence, okay? The way that we can probably explain it is, again, we'll put that horizontal line where you have one typology, the Christ against culture, which are the radicals on this side. And then you have the Christ of culture people whom we'll consider the accommodationists. They accommodate to culture at large. They're Christians, but they're very comfortable with the culture at large. Everything about the culture is good for them, right? And so those are the 2 radical differences, opposite positions in the pole. And then the median types are somewhere in between. So the Christ above culture, and we refer to them as the synthetists, as we saw today. And then next week we'll look at the Christ and culture in paradox, and we will refer to them as dualists. Christ and culture in paradox. They hold both, so they're dualists. And then the Christ transforming culture typology, which we'll see last of all, will be the conversionist model, where Christ comes and converts the culture for the better. Well, I just wanted to thank you all for coming today. I appreciate that. I hope that you did gain some valuable information, especially if you do have some Catholic friends that you can talk about Thomas Aquinas with them now, right? Or if you got a Kindle or something, just download Summa Theologica and read it for yourselves. Exercise your brain. Use it, because it's a God-given gift. Work from the bottom up. You know, this kind of principles. They're good, honest principles, actually. Thomas Aquinas is great. It's fantastic. Do I agree with everything he says? Absolutely not. But are there good, valuable principles to learn there? Absolutely. So at this point, I'd just like to open the floor up to any questions. If anybody does have questions to ask about the Christ above culture typology that we looked at today, if there's anything or any comments that you would like to make, I simply ask that you would come forward and speak your question into the microphone, since all this stuff is being recorded for our podcasts.
I might have a little Catholic in me, I don't know.
Okay, that's good. That's a good thing.
All my life in each church they talk about works, and I know works does not save you. You have to.
You're a thoroughgoing Protestant.
Huh?
Thoroughgoing Protestant.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I don't think if you don't have works, I don't think you're saved. I don't think you can say you can accept Christ and then sit in your chair and do nothing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think if you're saved, you want to work.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
You'd just be sitting at home in your easy chair, right?
Uh-huh.
So I don't know. I just think if you're saved, you want to get out there and work. You want to go to church. You want to support your.
You want to do good works.
You want to do good works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And share and.
Mm-hmm.
But those that say, well, and I've heard you say that. If you're saved, if you think you're saved and you don't have to do anything else.
Yeah.
You don't have to, if somebody needs, you don't have to work in the church. You don't have to go out and help feed the poor. You can just sit there. Those people might think they're saved, but to me, I would have to question a little bit, because they don't have that urge to go work to be God's servant. And that's what we're supposed to be. We're servants.
Thank you, friend. Fantastic question. And it's the kind of question that we can spend hours and hours just discussing, but it kind of reminds me of the story of, Billy Graham used to do the Crusades. They used to call them Crusades back then, because it wasn't a politically incorrect term back in the day. And I remember the story that he was in Los Angeles and he does his crusade at the stadium. And then, of course, at the end of his preaching, he always calls people to come up and accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And so this famous mafioso, criminal guy, gets up off his chair and comes all the way up to the front and accepts Jesus Christ as his Savior at a Billy Graham crusade. But here's the catch. He doesn't change. He continues being the same old mafioso doing criminal activity and stuff. Is he saved? Well, if you're saved by grace, then he just gets saved by grace and he doesn't have to work, doesn't have to change, doesn't have to do nothing else.
I think that's where your faith without works.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. So that's a very, very difficult question. Works and faith, what's the relationship between them? And so I'll just point out two. There are many others, but the two main fundamental ones from the Catholic point of view, as we saw, and we'll call this soteriology. Soteriology is a technical term for the doctrine of salvation, because the word soter means savior or salvation in the Greek. So soteriology is, what is the doctrine of salvation? Well, in the Catholic view, as we saw, it's a combination of our human works at the bottom, working up, that is then met by God's grace. And the term is a superadditum. A superadditum of God's grace is met, because on our human works, on our human efforts alone, according to Catholic theology, you will never be saved. So it's not a works-based salvation either. It's actually a combination of works and God's grace. That's their soteriology. What does Protestant soteriology look like? Salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone. Sola gratia, sola fide. Grace alone, faith alone. That's the radical cry of the Protestant Reformation. There are no works whatsoever that you can add to your salvation. So what's the relationship between faith and works in this? You are saved by grace alone, through faith alone, to do good works. The good works don't save you, but if you're truly and radically saved and born again in the Christian family and in Protestant theology, it reflects in the way that you live your life. It reflects in your moral character, in your work ethic, in your social responsibilities toward each other. It changes your life. In other words, salvation doesn't just come to you and then you can just go on living a mafioso lifestyle, killing people and doing all kinds of crazy criminal activities. You can't do that in Protestant theology. In fact, one of the protests that Protestant theology had was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he referred to the idea as what some people have looked at as cheap grace. We forget that grace actually cost God his most invaluable thing. It cost him his only son. And so grace, if we're saved by grace alone, we got to remember that it's a grace that cost God everything. It's not cheap. But there are too many Christians in America today that live by this principle of cheap grace. Oh, I walked up at the Billy Graham crusade. I'm saved. Now let me go ahead and cheat in business. Right? Lie, steal, drink, get drug addicted, live a hedonistic lifestyle that really doesn't represent the Christian family at all. And that is not Protestant soteriology at all. The distinction needs to be made very clearly, however, that there's nothing that you can do that saved you. God saved you, and then the good works come after that. I hope that helps.
Yeah.
Good.
Although there are some very good people, they may be atheists or agnostic.
Absolutely.
That's wonderful.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, there are a lot of non-Christians out there in this world who live moral lives which are way, way better than some Christians who go to church every day on a Sunday. Why is that? Well, because there's this common grace that's given to everybody. There's a distinction between common grace and salvific grace also. They might not have been saved by God's grace, but they still partake in the common grace that's given by God to all of humanity. And so they do have a conscience. And they heed that conscience. Paul says in Romans chapter 2 and 3, even people who have never heard of God, they have a consciousness of right and wrong. And some of those people try to live through that consciousness of right and wrong. And they honor God indirectly by doing so, says the Apostle Paul in Romans.
I kind of truly believe that God is still trying
Yeah.
into people and into every atheist.
Absolutely. We will look at that as we go more into the Protestant Reformation with the last two typologies, because that's leading into John Calvin. John Calvin believed that a semen religionis, a seed of religion, has been planted into every human being. So that seed needs to be nurtured, of course, to grow. But every human being, regardless of whether they're Christians or not, have that seed of religion in them. And ultimately, if it's nurtured correctly and properly, it can lead to a life of faith and discovery of who God is in them.
That's God's image.
Yeah,
We're created in His
yeah, all human beings, regardless of whether they're Christians or not. So every person that you see out there in the world is functionally created in God's image, not ontologically. And there needs to be a very careful distinction between the two, because 18th, 19th century theology sometimes mistook the image of God to mean I physically resemble God. And that's not what the image of God is, because God is not a human being. He's not a physical being. God is spirit, the Bible tells us. Rather, the image of God is how we function in the world. That's reflecting God's image. We reflect God's goodness by doing good things in the world. That's functional image of God. Ontological image of God leads to some major problems, as it did in 19th century Europe, where Judaism, anti-Semitism, racism, slavery, and all those things. Those people were not. They didn't resemble physically God, right? They were dark-skinned, they were yellow-skinned, they were different, because some of their conceptions were that it's a physical resemblance, but it never is.
Although we still like to remember the classic portrait you have that most Americans look at him as blue-eyed, blonde.
Yeah. Most people in the world have a conception of God in that way. Yeah.
Well, I never have.
Yeah. Good for you. Yeah.
No one really knows what he looks like.
Right. Certainly not. But when people ask me, well, what do you think Jesus looked like? I say, just look at the Middle East right now.
That's what I think.
And you see those dark-skinned people in the Middle East? That's probably what he looked like. Yeah. So.
God's a different.
Good questions. Just a quick reminder. I hope that you can come next week again. And we have the Christ and Culture in Paradox, which is the protest of that stubborn, rebellious German Augustinian monk, Martin Luther. And it's going to be pretty interesting too. So, yeah. So, thank you all for coming today.